The morning of the 14th commencement started the way the previous 13 had started, not with ceremony, with work. Dr. Evelyn Grace Okafor arrived at Harmon County Preparatory Academy at 5:47 in the morning, which was earlier than the custodial staff, but not by much. She drove herself, as she always did. She parked in the principal's space behind the main building, which was designated with a sign she had never requested, and had arrived one morning 6 years ago, placed there by the plant manager, who had said, when she asked about it, "Dr. Okafor, you've been parking in the wrong spot for 6 years. This is yours." She had said nothing. She had parked there every day since, not because she felt entitled to it, but because arguing with the plant manager about parking seemed like an inefficient use of the morning. The athletic field was already being set up. The white chairs were being arranged in their rows by the physical education department, who had volunteered for this as they volunteered every year because the PE department understood that the commencement ceremony was a logistical operation, and logistical operations required the people who understood physical space. The podium was in position. The banner, blue and gold, Harmon County Preparatory Academy class of the current year, was being hung between two portable stands by the art teacher Marcus Bell, who did this every year and who had developed over 14 years the particular expertise of someone who has hung the same banner in the same location enough times that the process has become ceremonial in itself. Dr. Okafor walked the field. She did this every commencement morning, walked the full perimeter of the setup, noting what needed adjustment, what was correct, what the light would do to the stage in the afternoon, where the sight lines were good and where they were impeded. She had learned to do this from her predecessor, Dr. Jerome Adeyemi, who had walked the field before every ceremony with the particular attentive presence of someone who understood that the ceremony was not the event. The ceremony was the culmination of the event, and the event had been happening for 4 years, and the ceremony deserved the same quality of preparation as everything that had preceded it. She had inherited the practice and the principle behind it. The practice walk the field. Look at what is there. Correct what needs correcting before the ceremony begins, because what cannot be corrected before becomes a distraction during, and the ceremony is not the moment for distraction. The principle, the ceremony, is not the thing. The thing is the 4 years of work that produced the people who will walk across the stage, and the ceremony is the moment when the 4 years becomes visible to everyone who was not in the building while it was happening. The parents, the families, the community, the people who will receive the graduates after they cross the stage and move into the next phase of their lives. The ceremony is a public statement about what happened in the years before it, and the public statement deserves to be exactly right. She had been a principal for 14 years. Before that, she had been an assistant superintendent for the Harmon County District for 4 years. Before that, she had been a department chair at Lincoln High School in the East District, which was a different district entirely, and had learned in that role the specific education available in the middle management of a public institution. You see more from the middle than you do from the top, and what you see teaches you things about what the top will need to do that the top cannot see for itself. She had been a vice principal. She had been a principal at a Title III campus in the same district as Lincoln, a campus with different challenges from the one she now ran, but with the same essential truth at its center. The students who were there because the geography of their families' lives had placed them there, and the school's job was to be excellent regardless of what the geography had suggested they deserved. She had been an assistant superintendent a second time in a different district, which was an administrative role she had accepted because the superintendent had offered her the equity portfolio, which meant she was responsible for the district's approach to the educational outcomes of students from underserved populations. She had done that work for 4 years. She had produced 2 policy changes and 1 curriculum revision that the district had implemented, and 1 that it had declined to implement, and she had understood at the end of those 4 years that the equity portfolio was more powerful when held by someone who ran a school than when held by someone who ran policy for schools that someone else ran. She had applied for the principal position at Harmon County Preparatory. The district had offered her 3 other positions first. She had said this one. The district had said this school has a 53% graduation rate and a 17 recommendation curriculum audit and a 31% teacher turnover. She had said, I know, this one. She had a Ph.D. in educational leadership from Howard University, where she had written her dissertation on the relationship between institutional self-assessment and student outcome trajectories in Title I campuses. The dissertation had argued with evidence from 47 schools over 15 years that the most powerful predictor of student outcome improvement in a low-performing school was not additional funding or curriculum reform or teacher training in isolation. It was the revision of the institutional narrative about the students the school was serving. Schools that described their student population as challenged produced challenged students. Schools that described their student population as capable and in need of better support produced students who were capable and who received better support. She had written that dissertation. She had then gone and run the school. She had a patience for bureaucratic friction that had been developed over 23 years to a specific functional tolerance, not indifference, but the capacity to persist through friction without being shaped by it. Friction was part of the work. The work was building something that was worth fighting to build, and the fighting was a feature, not a failure. She had built the school she now ran, not the building. The building had been there since 1978. A 2-story brick structure set back from the sidewalk on Harmon Avenue, with a parking lot that needed resurfacing every 4 years, and a gymnasium that had last been updated in 1993, and that she had successfully argued to the Capital Planning Committee 2 years ago should be replaced a project that was now in its 2nd year of construction behind the East Wing. But the thing the building had become in her 14 years that was hers. Harmon County Preparatory had been, when she arrived, a Title I campus with a 53% graduation rate, a teacher. Turnover of 31% annually, a curriculum audit that had produced 17 recommendations for intervention and a student body that the district had in internal documents. She had discovered in her first week categorized under a rubric that translated to low priority for resource allocation. She had read those documents once. She had not read them again. She had read the students instead. She had read what they could do and what they had been told they could not do, and she had understood that the distance between those 2 readings was not a fact about the students, but a fact about the institutions that had assessed them. The assessment was incorrect. Correcting it was her job. She had begun by walking the halls every morning at 7:15 before the students arrived, and every afternoon at 4 after the last bus. Not to be seen to see, to understand which corners of the building felt safe and which did not, which classrooms had teachers who arrived early and which had teachers who arrived at the last possible moment, which student-made artwork was on the walls and which walls were bare and what the bare walls said about the rooms behind them. She had walked the building for 3 weeks before she held her first staff meeting because she wanted to understand what she was actually looking at before she said a word about what it should become. The staff meeting had been 48 minutes long. She had said, I am not here to make this school better. I am here to make it correct. Better implies it was previously acceptable and can now be incrementally improved. Correct implies there is a standard it should meet, and it will meet that standard, and the standard is every student who walks into this building deserves an education that prepares them for a life of their choosing. That is not aspirational. That is the job. 3 teachers had resigned by the end of the week. She had replaced them. She had restructured the faculty evaluation process, adding classroom observation protocols that were specific, documented, and connected to professional development rather than punitive action, which produced 1 of 2 outcomes in every teacher who went through them. Either the teacher improved, which was the desired outcome, or the teacher revealed that the specific competencies the students needed were not ones the teacher was willing to develop, which produced a resignation or an amicable separation. 17 of the school's 31 teachers had left in her first 2 years. 17 had been replaced by teachers she had recruited with the specific requirement that they understood what the work was. She had added 4 sections of dual enrollment coursework with the community college 3 miles north, which required negotiating a curriculum articulation agreement that had not previously existed, and that the community college had initially declined to enter on the grounds that the student population was not assessed as college-ready. She had brought data to that meeting. She had brought specific student portfolios and assessment results that she had compiled herself over 4 months of classroom observation. She had said, "These students are college-ready." The measurement instrument you are using to assess college readiness was not designed with this population in mind and is measuring something other than college readiness. I am asking you to enter this agreement based on the performance data I am presenting with a 1-year review at the end of the first cohort. The community college had agreed. The first cohort had produced a 91% pass rate in the dual enrollment courses, which was higher than the district-wide average for dual enrollment students in standard track. She had built the mentorship program from a list of 43 names she had gathered at 2 Chamber of Commerce events she had attended without being invited, by walking up to the right people and saying, "I have students who need mentors, not generic mentors. Mentors with specific professional backgrounds who can show a student what a path into a field they are considering actually looks like." The program now ran 62 active mentor pairs. She had recruited Dr. Cassandra Wells as Director of College Counseling, a recruitment that had required 4 conversations over 3 months because Cassandra Wells was at a prestigious independent school in Atlanta and had no professional reason to come to a Title I campus in Harmon County. The reason Evelyn Okafor had offered her was not professional. She had said, "Cassandra, you told me once that the work you want to do is find the student who has been told they have no options and show them what their options are. I have a building full of those students. Come and do the work you want to do." Wells had come. In the first year, she had produced a college acceptance rate of 63%. In the current year, it was 87%. That had been 11 years ago. The graduation rate at Harmon County Preparatory Academy was now 94%. The college acceptance rate was 87%. The school had been designated a National Blue Ribbon School by the United States Department of Education, one of 3 schools in the state to receive the designation in the current year, and the only Title I campus among them. When the designation had arrived, Evelyn Okafor had read the letter at her desk alone at 7 in the morning before anyone else arrived. She had read it twice. Then she had set it on her desk and looked at the window that faced Harmon Avenue, and she had thought about the internal district document she had found in her first week, the one that had used the phrase "low priority" for resource allocation to describe the student body she was now standing in front of 14 years later. She had thought about the 43 students who had crossed the stage at her first commencement, 8 of whom had been on track to drop out when she arrived, and all 8 of whom had graduated. She had thought about their faces at the podium when she had put the diploma in their hands. She had not cried. She had sat at her desk and thought clearly about what the designation meant and what it required of her going forward, which was what she did with everything that mattered. She thought clearly about what it required, and then she went and met the requirement. The morning of the 14th commencement, Dr. Okafor walked the field and noted 3 chairs that needed repositioning in the second row, a tent stake that had not been fully driven on the east corner, and a microphone cable that crossed the stage at an angle that would be a tripping hazard for anyone approaching the podium from the left. She corrected the chairs herself. She called the plant manager about the tent stake. She rerouted the cable. Then she went inside to review the day's schedule. She had 187 seniors graduating. She knew their names. Not as a performance of knowing she knew them the way you know the people whose daily presence has been part of your working life for 4 years. She had seen them in the hallway and in the parent conferences and in the detention log and in the college acceptance letters that had come in over the spring. She knew which of them had almost not made it to this morning, and why and what it had taken, and which teachers had been the ones who had made the difference for those particular students. Her son Marcus was not among the graduating class. He was 27, a materials scientist in Atlanta, working on polymer composites for a company that made lightweight structural components for the aerospace industry, which was a field he had arrived at through a path that Evelyn Okafor found entirely characteristic. He had been interested in chemistry in high school, had pursued chemical engineering at Georgia Tech on a partial scholarship. Had discovered during an internship in his junior year that the application of materials science to structural problems was more interesting to him than the laboratory work he had initially imagined for himself, and had followed the interest with the deliberate, patient focus of someone who had been taught to understand that following an interest correctly takes longer than following an instruction, but produces something more durable. He had graduated from Harmon County Preparatory Academy 14 years ago in the class that had graduated the year before she arrived. He had been one of 43 seniors that year. He had been accepted to Georgia Tech on partial scholarship and had gone, and she had received the news not as his principal but as his mother from her apartment in the West District where she was still the assistant superintendent. She had come to Harmon County Preparatory the following year. Marcus had finished his degree the year after that. They did not talk often about the overlap, the fact that she had arrived at his school the year after he left it, that she had spent 14 years building what might have been available to him if the timing had been different. They did not talk about it because what would have been the point of the conversation? The thing she was building was not for him specifically. It was for the students who were there when she was there. That was how the work worked. You showed up when you showed up, and you built what needed building, and the students who were there for the building got to benefit from it. And the students who had been there before you arrived had already moved on, and your relationship with them was not as their principal, but as the person who built what they might have had. Marcus understood this. He was his mother's son. He was flying in for the ceremony. He had said when she told him about the keynote speaker and the blue ribbon designation and the 187 names she would be reading, "Mom, I'll be there." She had said, "You don't have to." He had said, "I know. I want to see the school you built." She had not said anything to that. There was nothing to say. He was coming. He would see it. He would see more than he expected to see on that particular Tuesday afternoon in May. She sat at her desk and reviewed the program. 187 names, the order of processional, the keynote speaker who this year was Dr. Lillian Forsyth, the State Commissioner of Education, who had been a friend of Evelyn Okafor's for 22 years since they had met at an educational leadership conference in Atlanta when Evelyn was still a department chair and Lillian was an assistant principal in a district on the other side of the state, and they had been seated at the same table at the conference dinner and had discovered over the course of the meal that they had an entirely compatible theory of what a school was for and what a leader's relationship to a school's community should be. 22 years. She had called Lillian when she got the blue ribbon designation. She had not called to report it. She had called because Lillian was who she called when something happened that she needed to say to someone who understood what it had cost. Lillian had listened and had said, I know what you built. I was watching." Then she had paused and said, "Evelyn, I want to give the keynote at your commencement this year. Not as a formal gesture. As myself." Evelyn had said, "I was hoping you'd say that." The ceremony was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon. At 8:47 that morning, her phone rang. It was the superintendent's office, not Dr. Marcus Webb himself, but his administrative coordinator, Renata, who called with a quality of professional neutrality that suggested she was conveying information she had been directed to convey, and was doing so with the minimum of editorial content. Renata said, "Dr. Okafor, the superintendent, wants you to know that the Harmon County Police Department has received a complaint regarding today's ceremony." She paused. She said the complaint was filed by someone in Councilman Ayres's office. She paused again. She said, "I don't have the specific content of the complaint, but the superintendent wanted you to be aware." Dr. Okafor said, "Thank you, Renata." She set the phone down. She looked at the window of her office for a moment. The athletic field was visible from where she sat, the rows of white chairs, the stage with its banner, the morning light at the angle it always had in May, low and warm from the east, giving the field the quality that early morning light gives to things that are about to become significant. She thought about Councilman Raymond Ayres, who represented the 3rd District of Harmon County and who had been for 18 months consistently positioned in the public record as the primary opponent of a school redistricting plan that Dr. Okafor had testified in favor of at 2 separate board hearings and 1 legislative committee hearing. The redistricting plan was technical in its description and simple in its human significance. The attendance boundaries in Harmon County had been drawn in 1991 and had not been adjusted in 33 years. In those 33 years, the demographics of the county had changed in ways the 1991 boundaries did not account for. 3 neighborhoods that had been working class in 1991 were now gentrifying their school populations, shifting toward students with more resources. 3 other neighborhoods that had been mixed income in 1991 were now concentrated poverty areas, their school populations shifting toward students with less. The boundaries unchanged had the effect of directing the students with fewer resources away from the district's stronger campuses and toward its weaker ones, not by design, but by the accumulated effect of 33 years of demographic shift on a static geography. The redistricting plan proposed adjusting the boundaries to reflect the current distribution of the student population. It was technically a boundary adjustment. What it was in human terms was an acknowledgement that the boundaries as drawn were failing the students they were supposed to serve, and that the board had both the authority and the obligation to address that. Evelyn Okafor had testified at both board hearings with data. She had named the census tracts and the schools and the resource levels and the graduation rates. She had said the boundaries as drawn are not a neutral feature of the educational landscape. They are a policy choice that has been left in place long enough to become invisible. The board has the authority to make a different policy choice, and I am here to provide the factual basis for what that different choice would produce. Councilman Ayers had attended both hearings. He had sat in the 3rd row with Kevin Price and had not testified, but had in the months between the 2nd hearing and the current day consistently described the redistricting plan in public statements as a threat to neighborhood school identity, a phrase that Evelyn Okafor recognized from 30 years in education as language that has a technical meaning, which is the preservation of geographically coherent school communities, and a political use, which is the maintenance of existing attendance patterns, regardless of whether those patterns produce equitable educational outcomes. She had said so publicly at the legislative committee hearing. Councilman Ayers had been in that room. Kevin Price had been taking notes. The redistricting vote was scheduled for the fall. It had been delayed twice. The delay was procedural in description and political in reality, and Evelyn Okafor understood the difference. She thought about all of this in the moment after the phone call from the superintendent's office, looking at the athletic field from her office window on the morning of the 14th commencement. She thought this complaint is not about a venue coordination meeting. This complaint is about the redistricting vote and the public record of who I am and what I have said and what I have built and what it would mean for this community if I were associated in the public record with a conduct complaint. Evelyn Okafor sat at her desk and thought about Kevin Price and the phone call from the superintendent's office, and she made a decision about what this information was and what she was going to do with it today. She was going to graduate 187 students. She was going to do it correctly, completely, and without allowing any external distraction to interrupt the ceremony that those students had spent 4 years earning. She thought about the 187 students. She knew them. Not performatively, she knew them the way you know people whose daily existence has been part of your working life for 4 years. She knew Tamara Jefferson, who had transferred in from a school in the adjacent district in her sophomore year and had spent the first 3 months at Harmon County Preparatory, believing that the school's culture of expectation was a performance and not an actual standard. Tamara had come to Evelyn's office in December of that year and had said, "I don't understand why people here act like they're actually going to go somewhere." Evelyn had said, "Because they are." Tamara had looked at her. She had said, "You actually believe that." Evelyn had said, "I believe it about you specifically." Tamara was graduating today with acceptance to the University of Georgia and a merit scholarship that covered 60% of her first year. She knew Marcus Osei, no relation to Jalen, who had been on a medical alert plan for most of his junior year after a health episode that had required 3 weeks of hospital stay and had produced a course completion challenge that had, in a different school in a different system, would likely have resulted in a credit deficit that would have required an extra semester. At Harmon County Preparatory, it had resulted in a recovery plan that Evelyn Okafor had supervised personally, working with his teachers to design a modified schedule that met all graduation requirements within the original timeline. He had met every requirement. He was graduating on time. She knew the stories of every student in that class. She knew them because knowing them was the job. Not a supplement to the job, not the feel-good part of being a principal, the actual work. You could not build a school correctly if you did not understand what you were building it for. And what you were building it for was the specific people who walked through its doors, and the specific people who walked through its doors had specific stories and specific capacities and specific obstacles that the school's design either addressed or failed to address, and knowing the difference required knowing the people. She was going to graduate them today. Then she would deal with whatever was in Kevin Price's complaint. She stood up. She put on her robe and hood, the regalia of the Ph.D. she had earned at Howard, which she wore to every commencement, because the students who were putting on their caps and gowns today deserved to see what a completed educational journey looked like, and because she had earned the right to wear it, and she was not in the habit of leaving earned things aside. She went back to the field. By noon, the students were arriving. They came in groups and individually in their blue and gold caps and gowns, some of them arriving with both parents and some with one parent and some with grandparents and some alone, because the family situation of every student in the building was its own specific situation, and commencement morning reflected that. The gown rentals had been handled by the school's financial aid coordinator, Denise Okonkwo, who had spent the last 2 weeks ensuring that no student's name was removed from the graduation list due to an unpaid gown balance, a task she had performed quietly and without announcement, because announcement would have required the students to know it had been necessary. And knowing it had been necessary was a kind of pressure that the day did not need. Many of them came through the main entrance to the field and stopped for a moment at the entrance, adjusting their caps, looking at the rows of white chairs and the stage and the banner, with the particular expression of people who are standing at a threshold they have been approaching for long enough that the approach itself has become familiar, and the actual threshold, now that they are standing at it, is disorienting. In the specific way that completion is always disorienting. You expect it to feel more certain, and the feeling you have is more complicated than certainty. Dr. Okafor moved through them the way she always moved through commencement morning present, unhurried, making contact, saying names. She had a particular way of saying a student's name that was different from the way a teacher calls roll. It was the way you say the name of someone you see, not someone you are accounting for. Students who heard her say their name on commencement morning tended to stand up a little straighter afterward, not because she commanded it, but because being seen has a physical effect on people who have not always been seen. She found Jalen Osei near the stage entrance standing alone. This was unlike him. Jalen was the kind of person who organized the space around him: student council, president, team captain, the natural center of whatever gathering he was part of. His standing alone near the stage entrance, apart from the clusters of students forming and dispersing across the field, meant something. She went to him. She said, "Jalen." He turned. His expression was trying for composed and not fully succeeding. She said, "You all right?" He said, "I keep thinking this is the last time I'll be here." She said, "You'll come back. The alumni who come back are the ones the next class looks to." He said, "Dr. Okafor, I wasn't supposed to be here." She said, "You were supposed to be here." He said, "You know what I mean." She said, "I know exactly what you mean. And you're right that someone told you that. And you built what you built anyway. And you're here on the other side of it. That's the thing worth holding." He nodded. The composure steadied. She thought watching him about what it had cost a 17-year-old to transfer schools in the middle of junior year to sit in a new classroom, surrounded by people who had known each other for 2 years, and who had been taught to believe in their own potential in ways that the school he had come from had not taught. She had watched Jalen Osei navigate that adjustment over 2 semesters with the particular focused determination of someone who has decided that the new environment is real, and that the version of himself it is offering him is also real, and that the only task is to become it. He had become it. She moved on through the crowd. She found 3 more students who needed a moment and gave each one the moment they needed calibrated to what each one specifically needed, which was not the same thing for each of them, because they were not the same people. That was the principle. The school was built on. They are not the same, and the education must know this. At 1:42, the faculty and staff were in their positions. The families had filled the chairs on the east side of the field. The 312 family members and invited guests were seated. Dr. Cassandra Wells was in the 3rd row of the faculty section with the folder containing every graduate's college acceptance on her lap, which she carried to every commencement, not because she referred to it, but because it was the physical record of the year's work, and the year's work deserved to be present at its completion. Marcus Bell was backstage helping Dr. Forsyth with the lavalier microphone and explaining the podium light, which had a switch that was not intuitively positioned. At 1:53, the band began the opening processional notes. She found Jalen Osei near the stage entrance, standing alone, which was unlike him. Jalen had been the student council president and the center fielder for the school's baseball team, and the student who had in February of his junior year been told by the college counselor at his previous school that his test scores suggested he aim for 2-year options. He had transferred to Harmon County Preparatory in the 2nd semester of his junior year. He had retaken the standardized test under the preparation program Dr. Wells had built. He had applied to 7 4-year institutions. He had been accepted to 5, including his first choice, the University of Virginia. He was standing alone near the stage entrance with an expression that was trying to be composed and was not fully succeeding. She said, "Jalen." He looked at her. She said, "You all right?" He said, "I keep thinking this is the last time I'll be here." She said, "You'll come back. The alumni who come back are the ones the next class knows to look to." He said, "Dr. Okafor, I wasn't supposed to be here." She said, "You were supposed to be here." He said, "You know what I mean?" She said, "I know what you mean. And you're right that someone told you that you weren't. And you're here anyway. That's the thing worth holding." He nodded. The composure improved. She moved on through the crowd. She found 3 more students who needed a moment. She gave each one the moment they needed, without making it into something larger than it was. Because the skill of commencement morning is not ceremony. It is presence, and presence does not announce itself. At 1:42, the faculty and staff were in their positions. The families had filled the chairs on the east side of the field. The 312 family members and invited guests were seated. The faculty and staff were lined on the west side. The keynote speaker, Dr. Lillian Forsyth, was backstage with Marcus Bell, who was showing her where the podium light switch was and explaining the microphone, which was a lavalier that clipped to the collar. Forsyth had said, "I've worn 1,000 of these." Marcus had said, "I know. I'm just being thorough." At 1:53, Evelyn Okafor was at the side of the stage, watching the processional form. The band was beginning the opening notes. The students were falling into their lines with the practiced movement of people who had rehearsed this, and were now doing it for real. And the doing it for real had a quality that the rehearsals had not, because the people watching from the seats were the people for whom this moment had been organized. She looked out at the seated audience. She saw Marcus in the 4th row, her son in a white shirt without a tie because he had never worn ties without complaint, and their eyes met across the distance of the field, and he did something with his face that was not quite a smile, but was in the direction of one. She gave him the same expression back. She thought about what it had meant for him to come. Marcus was 27 years old and was a materials scientist in Atlanta, working in polymer composites for aerospace applications, at a firm whose clients she did not entirely understand, but whose work she had listened to him describe across 3 years of phone calls, with the particular attention she brought to anything her son was invested in. He had studied at Georgia Tech. He had gotten through it with the combination of focus and particular stubbornness that she recognized as something she had given him without intending to the capacity to be in a difficult room and refuse to become the difficult room's assessment of what was possible. He was at Harmon County Preparatory that afternoon in the specific capacity of his mother's son, which meant he was in the faculty section rather than the family section, which meant he had been told to wear the white shirt. He had complied with the shirt and not with the tie. That negotiation had been completed on the phone 2 weeks earlier. She had said the shirt is the argument. The tie is optional. He had said, I still don't understand why the tie is ever the argument. She had said, I know. That is why you need the shirt. He was 30 feet from her across the field, and she could see from 30 feet the expression he was using to contain whatever was happening in him on this 14th commencement morning. She knew the expression. She had been watching him use it since he was 8 years old, the contained, carefully managed face of someone who has something to say, and has decided that this moment is not the moment for it because the moment requires something else. He had learned it from her, which she knew, and had never commented on, because commenting on it would require explaining the thing she had passed along to him, and the practice was more useful than the explanation. She thought, this is the 14th time. This is the part that does not get smaller. She was wrong about what was going to happen next. She was not wrong about that. Officer Brett Callaghan was 31 years old. He had been on the Harmon County Police Department for 3 years, the last 8 months of them on Special Assignments Detail, which was the unit that provided security presence at public events, venue patrols, and ceremonial functions. It was not the most prominent assignment in the department, but it was the one that had been available when he requested a transfer from patrol, and he had taken it because the variety of the work suited his temperament. He was better at the dynamics of a crowd than he was at the rhythms of a single patrol route. He was not the senior officer on the commencement security detail. That was Sergeant Diane Foley, 43, who had been managing event security for 7 years, and who had run in that time more than 300 individual events ranging from city council sessions to concert venue security to exactly 11 school commencement ceremonies. She briefed every detail the same way: presence, not intervention; visible, not intrusive; no unilateral action; all decisions elevated to her. She said it every time, not because she doubted the officers she worked with, but because the principle was sound enough to be worth restating, and the consequences of not restating it were events like this one. She had briefed the detail that morning at 7:30 in the Harmon County Preparatory parking lot. Callaghan had been present. He had heard every word of the briefing. He had received the complaint through a different channel. At 11:23 that morning, his personal department email had received a message from the duty lieutenant's office forwarding a formal complaint filed by Kevin Price, aide, to Councilman Raymond Ayers regarding alleged disruptive conduct by Dr. Evelyn Okafor at a venue coordination meeting on the 21st. The complaint requested officer attendance at the commencement ceremony to address the matter. The duty lieutenant had forwarded it to Foley's detail email and to Callaghan's, which was the error that produced everything that followed. The forward should have been to Foley only as the senior officer. Callaghan had received it in addition to Foley. Foley had read the complaint and assessed it as administrative, not actionable on site, and had made a note to follow up with the duty lieutenant after the ceremony. She had also flagged it in her detail log as requiring verification of the underlying facts before any action, which was the standard protocol, and which was the reason she was the senior officer and had been the senior officer for 7 years. Callaghan had read the complaint and had made a different assessment. He had been on the Harmon County force for 3 years. He understood the structure of a formal complaint. He understood that a complaint from a councilman's office was a complaint from a person with political standing, and he associated political standing with the kind of credibility that made verification feel redundant. He had received complaints before. Most of them were from individuals without political standing, and those required verification. This one was from someone with standing, which felt different. The feeling was incorrect. The feeling was the product of an assumption he had been making without examining it, which was people with authority or political standing do not file false complaints. The assumption was not stated anywhere in his training. It had arrived through the accumulated experience of working in an institution where complaints from politically connected sources were treated differently from complaints from individuals without connections, and the differential treatment had become, over 3 years, a habit of mind that he had not noticed, because it was not the kind of habit that announces itself. He did not understand because no one had told him, and because the afternoon's events would not give him the opportunity to learn before the damage was done that the complaint was false, that the venue coordination meeting referenced in it had not occurred, and that the purpose of the complaint was to create a documented record of opposition to a school administrator who had been an effective public voice against a position held by Councilman Ayers, and whose public profile would be effectively damaged if her name appeared in a formal complaint in the period before a redistricting vote. He had not called Foley. He had read the complaint, clipped his radio to his belt, and walked toward the stage. The processional was underway. 187 seniors were moving in 2 lines from the staging area at the east end of the field toward the rows of white chairs arranged in front of the stage. The band, 14 students conducted by Ms. Patricia Arma, who had been the school's music director for 9 years, and who took the commencement processional with the specific seriousness of someone who understands that a piece of music heard in this context will be the piece of music these students associate with this day for the rest of their lives, was playing Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance at the measured tempo that Marcus Bell and Ms. Arma had agreed on in their annual pre-ceremony conversation, not too slow, which made it funereal, not too fast, which made it frivolous. The measured tempo of something that deserves to be savored. The families and guests in the rows of white chairs on the east side of the field had turned in their seats to watch. Many of them were on their feet before the processional was halfway down the field, because standing is what you do when something you have been waiting for a long time is arriving. Mothers had their phones raised. Fathers were doing the thing that fathers do at graduations, trying to locate one specific person in a line of identically dressed individuals, which is always harder than it should be, and which produces, at the moment of successful location, an expression that is extremely difficult to look at without having a reaction. The light of the late afternoon in May in Georgia had the specific quality that light has at that hour, in that month, in that latitude, warm direct arriving at an angle that was low enough to give everything on the field a slight golden cast, turning the white gowns slightly gold, and the stage slightly gold, and the banner slightly gold. It was the light that makes ceremony look the way ceremony is supposed to look, as though the moment itself has been illuminated. Dr. Okafor was at the stage steps. She was watching the processional the way she always watched it, with the complete attention she brought to anything that mattered, which was everything she was involved in, but with a specific quality of attention for this moment, because this moment was the visible result of 4 years of invisible work and it deserved to be witnessed correctly. She saw Callaghan before he reached her. She saw him coming across the field in the direction of the stage, and she recognized his trajectory not toward the perimeter, not toward the audience, but toward her, and she thought with the practiced assessment of someone who has spent 23 years reading situations before they fully develop. This is the thing from this morning. She had known it would come. She had not known when, or in what form, or at what cost to this specific afternoon. But the phone call from the superintendent's office at 8:47 had told her something she had been in education long enough to understand. A complaint filed from a councilman's office on the morning of a ceremony that councilman had specific political reasons to want disrupted was not an accident of timing. It was the timing itself. She thought about the students. She thought about the 187 people in caps and gowns in 2 lines from the staging area, approaching their white chairs in the afternoon light. She thought about Jalen this morning near the stage entrance with the threshold expression on his face. She thought about the families in the east section on their feet before the processional was halfway down the field, turning to locate one specific person in a line of identically dressed individuals. She thought, I cannot stop what is coming across this field. She thought, I can only control what I am when it gets here. She had been in rooms like this before, rooms where the air changed, and the change required her to become still rather than reactive. 23 years had produced that education in the specific, irreversible way that only years can produce it, not a technique she applied, but an embodied knowing, the kind that arrives without being retrieved because it has become part of the structure of the person who holds it. She thought about the third year of her principalship, when the superintendent at the time, not Webb, his predecessor, a man who had referred to her school in a budget committee meeting as the South Campus, and who had never once used her name in 4 direct interactions, had declined to fund the dual enrollment expansion she had presented. She had gone back with additional data. She had been declined a second time. She had told the committee before leaving the allocation is available. What is not available is the willingness to make it, and those are different things. When I present this data to you again in 2 years, you will have spent 2 years paying the cost of the delay. The superintendent had asked her to leave the committee room. She had not left immediately. She had said these students are waiting for this decision in classrooms 3 miles from this room, and then she had left. 2 years later under Webb, the dual enrollment expansion had been funded. The first cohort had produced a 91% pass rate in dual enrollment courses, higher than the district average for students in the standard track. She had presented the results and had said, "I believe you have the original proposal from 2 years prior." She had said it without heat. She had said it because the record deserved to be complete, and the record included the cost of what had not been done when it should have been done. The record was always the argument. The record was what persisted when the room changed, when the superintendent changed, when the political standing of the people across the table from her changed. She had known this since her 3rd year as a principal, when the record was the only argument she had, and it had been enough. She thought, "I have built this record for 14 years. She thought, "I know what it holds." She did not move. She did not step toward him or away from him. She stood at the stage steps with her hands at her sides and her regalia on, and she waited for him to arrive. Because running from a thing you cannot prevent is not a response. Waiting for it with your conduct correct is the only response available, and it is also the only argument that when the moment is over will be unimpeachable. He reached the stage steps at 1:58. He said, "Dr. Okafor." She said, "Yes, officer. Can I help you?" He said, "I need to speak with you regarding a complaint that has been filed with the department." She said, "Can this wait until after the ceremony?" He said, "I'm afraid it can't, ma'am." She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the processional, which was still moving. She looked at the families in the white chairs, many of whom had noticed the officer at the stage steps and were watching with the particular alertness of people who have seen something interrupt, something they were not expecting to be interrupted. She looked at the students, still walking in their lines, some of whom had also noticed. She said, "Officer, I am in the middle of a commencement ceremony for 187 graduating students. Whatever is in the complaint can be addressed appropriately after this ceremony. I will come to the department myself this afternoon." He said, "Ma'am, I've been directed to address this on site." He had not been directed to address it on site. Foley had not given that direction. The duty lieutenant had not given that direction. The complaint document itself did not contain that language. He had read the complaint, assessed it as requiring his action, and arrived here on the basis of that assessment without consulting Foley, without contacting the duty lieutenant, and without checking whether the complaint's underlying facts had been verified. He said, "I need you to come with me." She said, "On what grounds?" He said, "There's a formal complaint against you, ma'am. I need to take your statement." She said, "Officer, you are standing at the stage of a commencement ceremony for students who have been working toward this morning for 4 years. Whatever is in the complaint, it does not require my immediate removal from this ceremony. I am asking you to exercise judgment." He said, "I understand, ma'am, but I need you to come with me." He reached for his handcuffs. The processional had stopped. Not all of it. The students at the front of the line had reached their chairs and were seated. But the students still in line had stopped moving. They had stopped the way people stop when something is wrong, and the stopping is the only thing available to them that is honest. They were standing in 2 lines on the field with their caps on and their gowns on, and they were looking at the stage steps where their principal was standing, and where an officer was standing with his handcuffs visible. The families in the chairs had stopped talking. The band had stopped playing. The field, which had been full of the sound of music and movement, was now something close to quiet. Dr. Marcus Webb was in the third row of the faculty section on the west side of the field. He was the Harmon County Superintendent, 58 years old, and he had been at Harmon County preparatory commencements for 6 of the 14. Dr. Okafor had run, and he had never seen anything like this. He stood up. He said, "Officer, I am the superintendent of Harmon County Schools. What is the nature of this complaint?" Callaghan turned. He said, "Sir, I need to ask you to step back." Webb said, "I am the superintendent of this school district. I am asking you to explain on what grounds you are interrupting this ceremony." Callaghan said, "I have a formal complaint from the duty lieutenant's office. Ma'am, I need you to come with me now." He took out the handcuffs. He said the words that would be repeated in every account of the next 48 hours. He said, "Dr. Okafor, I'm placing you under arrest." The field was very quiet. 187 students in their caps and gowns were standing in 2 interrupted lines, or sitting in their white chairs, and they were watching the stage steps where their principal was standing with her hands at her sides, and the officer was moving toward her with the handcuffs. Dr. Evelyn Grace Okafor stood at the stage steps, and she did not move, and she did not speak, and her face did not change. This was the dignity moment. It was the thing that would be described in the accounts that followed in the footage watched 4 million times in the testimony given to the DA's office, in the conversations that Dr. Forsyth would have with colleagues and policymakers for the following 18 months, described with the particular difficulty that people have when they are trying to convey something that must be witnessed to be fully understood. She stood. She was completely still in the way that something is still when all of its energy has been organized into presence rather than distributed into movement. Her regalia hung straight from her shoulders. The hood was positioned correctly. Her hands were at her sides. Her feet were at the stage steps where she had been standing for the last 3 minutes. She had not moved since Callaghan arrived. She was 62 years old. She had spent 23 years building institutions that were supposed to serve students who the institutions around them had decided were less worth serving. She had built one of 3 national blue ribbon schools in the state. She had testified before 2 boards and 1 legislative committee, and had brought data and had named names and had stood in rooms where the people across the table from her had looked at her with the expression that people have when they are performing engagement while waiting for the engagement to be over. She had stood in all of those rooms. She was standing here now. She did not look at Callaghan. She did not look at the handcuffs. She looked at her students, the ones in the interrupted lines who had stopped moving and turned to face the stage, and the ones in the seated rows who were watching with the specific, fixed attention of people who do not know what is going to happen next and are witnessing something they will not forget. She held the look the way she held everything difficult, without flinching, without performing anything, just present to the weight of the moment and to what it required of her, which was exactly what she was giving it. She thought about the first commencement she had run at this school 14 years ago. 43 students. 8 of them had almost not made it. She had put the diploma in each of their hands herself, as she always had, and she had said their names clearly as she always had, and when she had looked into their eyes in the 2 seconds of the handshake, she had seen something in each of them that she had been working toward for the entire year. The recognition that the thing they had been told they could not do was done. She thought about today's class. She thought, "I have to get back to them." Callaghan reached her. He said, "Turn around, please." She turned around. She put her hands behind her back. She did not resist. She did not speak. She conducted herself with the particular absolute correctness of someone who has understood that their conduct is the only argument available and who intends the argument to be from this moment forward unimpeachable. The handcuffs went on. 187 students and 312 family members and guests watched the handcuffs go on their principal's wrists at her school's commencement ceremony. And then something happened that no one had planned and no one had organized and no one had signaled. The students stood up, not all at once. It began at the front of the seated section with a student named Destiny Okonkwo, who was sitting in seat A1, the first seat of the first row of the graduates section, because she had been assigned seats alphabetically and her surname came first. She was 18 years old and had been at Harmon County Preparatory Academy for 4 years, and she had watched her principal every one of those days in the hallway in the morning at the weekly town halls, at the 2 parent conferences where she had sat beside her mother and listened to Dr. Okafor speak about her with the specific grounded regard of someone who knows exactly who you are and what you are capable of. She had sat in seat A1 and watched the officer approach the stage steps, and she had watched her principal stand still, and she had felt something move in her that was not a thought. It was older than a thought. It was the kind of response that arrives before language can catch up to it. She stood up. She did not say anything. She stood up. She faced the stage. The student beside her, Amara Ose. No relation to Marcus. Seat A2 saw Destiny stand, and she understood immediately what was happening, because understanding what was happening was the thing that the best students in this school had been developing since the day they arrived, the capacity to read a moment correctly and respond to it correctly. Amara stood up. She faced the stage. Then the third student in the row. Then the fourth. Then the row behind them began to stand, each student recognizing in the standing of the students in front of them the specific response that this specific moment required. It moved through the seated section like a current moving through water, not by force, not by instruction, but by the natural transmission of understanding from one person who has grasped something to the person beside them. In under 3 minutes, all the seated students were standing. In under 3 minutes, without a word, without a signal, without a single person organizing it, 187 students in their caps and gowns were on their feet facing the stage, completely silent. They did not applaud. They did not chant. They did not move. They stood in the rows of white chairs on the athletic field of their school, and they were silent and still, and the silence they produced was not passive. It was the most active thing on the field. It had weight. It had direction. It was aimed at the stage steps, at the officer and the handcuffs and the principal, and what it said, what it communicated without a single word being necessary was, "We see this. We are here. We are not going away. And you are going to have to account for what you are doing in front of all of us." The families in the chairs on the east side had gone quiet, watching the students rise. The silence had moved from the students outward the way silence moves when it has enough weight behind it. The faculty on the west side of the field had gone quiet. The band had stopped playing. Marcus Bell, backstage, heard the silence from the wing of the stage and walked to the entrance and looked out. 312 people plus 187 students plus faculty and staff. Complete silence. Dr. Lillian Forsyth had been backstage when the processional stopped. She had been reviewing her notes, not the prepared text of the keynote she had brought from her office, which she had abandoned 3 weeks ago when she decided to speak from what she actually knew rather than from what was appropriate to say. But the notes she had made in the margins of the prepared text over the preceding days. The specific things she wanted to say about this school and this principal, and what they represented that she had not found in the prepared version, but had found in the margins when she let herself write honestly rather than formally. Marcus Bell had come to the backstage entrance and said very quietly, "Commissioner, you need to see what's happening." She had come to the wing of the stage. She had stood in the wing and looked out at the field, and she had seen Callaghan at the stage steps, and Dr. Okafor standing with her hands at her sides, and then with her hands being placed behind her back. And she had seen the students, the silence moving through them, the standing beginning in the front row and moving back, the complete, sustained, enacted quiet of 500 people choosing silence as a statement. She stood in the wing for 7 seconds. She thought about 22 years of watching Evelyn Okafor work. She thought about the conference dinner in Atlanta where they had first met at a table for 6, and Evelyn had said the problem with educational policy is that it is made by people who have stopped seeing the student as an individual and have started seeing the student as a data point, and the data point is a useful thing to think with, but it is not a useful thing to teach. She had said it quietly to the table, not as a speech. Lillian had looked at her and had thought, I want to know this person for the next 22 years. She had. She walked onto the stage. She walked to the podium with the lavalier clipped to her collar and the handheld from the podium stand in her hand, and she stood at the podium and looked out at the field. The silence received her. She said, My name is Lillian Forsythe. I am the State Commissioner of Education for this state. I am the keynote speaker for this ceremony, and I have something to say before I give the speech I prepared, which I am going to discard, because what just happened on this field requires something different from a prepared speech. The field was very quiet. She said, I have known Dr. Evelyn Okafor for 22 years. I have known her as an administrator, as a colleague, as an advocate, and as a friend. Those are different things. I am not conflating them. As an administrator, she is among the most competent educational leaders I have encountered in 30 years in this field. As a colleague, she is a person whose judgment I trust completely, and whose counsel I have sought on more occasions than I can count. As an advocate, she has stood before 2 legislative committees in the last 18 months with data in her hands and the names of students in her mouth and said these children deserve better, and the policy that is failing them can be changed, and I am here to tell you exactly how to change it. She paused and looked at Callaghan. She said, I don't know what is in the complaint that brought you to this stage today. I know that Dr. Okafor is a person of documented, consistent, exceptional professional conduct who has never, in 22 years of my direct and sustained observation, conducted herself in any way that would produce a legitimate complaint of the nature you appear to be acting on. I am saying that into a microphone at this ceremony in front of these students because these students deserve to understand who their principal is. They deserve to hear from someone who has watched her work for 22 years, that the person who has invested her professional life in this school is known, is seen, and is not going to be reduced to a complaint form on the day of their commencement. She paused. She said, I am also saying it because it is true, and because someone should say it, and because I am the person with the microphone. The field held its silence. Sergeant Diane Foley had arrived at the stage steps 40 seconds earlier. She had received the radio call from the traffic officer at the field entrance at 2:13 while she was at the perimeter of the field's south end, which was where she had been standing since the processional began, visible present, as her protocol required. The traffic officer had said, Sarge, you need to get to the stage. She had said, what's happening? He had said, Callaghan. She had said, on my way. She had crossed the field at the pace that 7 years of event security had taught her, fast enough to arrive in time, controlled enough to arrive with the capacity to think clearly when she got there. Running produces adrenaline. Adrenaline produces the kind of decision-making that event security work exists to prevent. She moved at the pace of someone who has decided to be fast and to remain clear. She had reached the stage steps and assessed the scene in under 5 seconds. The officer, the principal, the handcuffs, the 500 people who were watching in complete silence, the State Commissioner of Education at the podium, the superintendent on his feet in the faculty section. She had made the assessment and made the decision simultaneously, which was the product of 7 years and 300 events. She said, Officer Callaghan, stand down, right now. He said, Sergeant, I was acting on a forwarded complaint from. She said, stand down. It was not a loud directive. It was not a threatening directive. It was the specific flat quality of a directive from someone who has made a decision and whose voice contains the complete certainty of that decision and is not interested in discussing the decision because the discussion would be in the wrong direction. Callaghan stopped moving. He stood in the specific, reduced stillness of someone who has just understood that the action they were in the middle of was the wrong action, and that the wrong action is now complete and unchangeable, and that the only remaining question is what comes next. Foley did not wait to find out what came next from him. She stepped forward. She said, Dr. Okafor, I apologize. She said it directly, looking at Evelyn Okafor, whose hands were still behind her back. She said it with the specific quality of apology that belongs to someone who is apologizing for an institution that has produced harm they could not prevent and that they intend to document and address. She removed the handcuffs herself efficiently, without ceremony, the way a person removes an error from a situation that deserves to be clear of it. Dr. Okafor's hands came forward. She brought them to her front and looked at her wrists for a moment, not at the marks the handcuffs had left, which were minimal. She looked at her hands, the hands of a 62-year-old woman who had been doing this work for 23 years, who had built something worth protecting, who had just had handcuffs placed on them at her school's 14th commencement ceremony. She held the look for 2 seconds. Then she looked at Foley. She said thank you. Then she looked at her students. The silence on the field had not broken. She stepped to the stage steps. She climbed them. She walked across the stage to the podium with the same quality of movement she brought to everything she did in this school. Purposeful, present, unhurried. She did not look at the families. She did not look at the faculty. She looked at the students in their rows of white chairs standing silent in the late afternoon light. Dr. Forsythe moved aside and offered the microphone. She took it. She stood at the podium and looked at her students for a long moment. She looked at them the way she had looked at the field from her window that morning, with the complete attention of someone who understands that what they are looking at deserves to be witnessed correctly. She looked at Destiny in seat A1, who had stood first. She looked at Jalen, who was standing in the 11th row with the expression of someone who has understood something large and is holding it carefully because it is too large to carry carelessly. She looked at the students who had stood in silence for the 2 minutes and 17 seconds it had taken for Foley to arrive and remove the handcuffs, and for the situation to resolve itself into this moment. She thought about what it had cost them to do that. She thought about what it meant that they had done it without being asked. She thought, this is the thing I was building. This is what 14 years was for. She said, class of this year, you are going to remember this day. You are going to remember it not because of what just happened to me. You are going to remember it because of what you did. She paused. She said, you stood up. You were silent. You were completely together and completely silent. And that is the most powerful thing I have witnessed on this field in 14 years of standing on it. You did not need to be told to do it. You did not need an instruction or a signal or an organizer. You understood what the moment required and you gave it without hesitation. She paused again. She said, I want to be specific about what I saw. I saw one student stand, and then the student beside her, and then the row behind. And it moved through you the way understanding moves through a community that has been built correctly, not by force and not by announcement, but by recognition. Each of you recognized what the one in front of you had understood, and you understood it too, and you acted on it. That is what 4 years here is supposed to build. Not just your transcripts, not just your acceptance letters, not just your test scores. This, the capacity to recognize what a moment requires and the willingness to give it together without being told. She looked at the field. She said, I am proud of you. I have been proud of you for 4 years. Today I am proud of you in a way that I did not expect and did not plan and will not forget. She set the microphone down. The silence broke. It broke in the way that something under sustained pressure breaks when the pressure is released completely all at once from everywhere on the field simultaneously. 312 family members and guests and 187 students and every faculty member on the west side of the field were on their feet, and the sound they made was not the polite applause of a ceremony, it was the full-throated, uncontrolled sound of people who have been holding something and have now been told they can let it go. It lasted for a long time. Dr. Evelyn Grace Okafor stood at the podium and received it with the same stillness she had brought to the stage steps, not performing anything, not diminishing anything, just present to what was happening and what it meant. She looked at Marcus in the 4th row of the faculty section. He was on his feet. He was not trying to hold the expression. Brett Callaghan had been escorted off the field by Sergeant Foley at 2:12 in the afternoon. Foley had walked him to the far end of the field away from the ceremony and had said, I will speak to you about the chain of command and the complaint protocol after this ceremony is over. He had said nothing. She had said, you are to remain at the perimeter. You are not to approach the stage again. He had remained at the perimeter. He had watched the commencement from there, which was not a comfortable position and was not intended to be. The ceremony proceeded from the point at which it had been interrupted. The silence broke in the way that pressure breaks when it is released completely all at once from everywhere on the field. 312 family members and guests, and 187 students and the faculty on the west side of the field were all on their feet simultaneously, and the sound that came from them was not the polite applause of a ceremony. It was the full-throated, uncontrolled sound of people who have been holding something for 2 minutes and 17 seconds, and have now been told that they can let it go. It lasted for a long time. Dr. Okafor stood at the podium and received it with the same stillness she had brought to the stage steps. She did not perform anything. She did not diminish anything. She stood in her regalia and let what was happening happen because it was the accurate response of 500 people to what they had witnessed, and the accurate response deserved to be received accurately. She looked at Marcus in the 4th row of the faculty section. Her son in the white shirt without the tie he had never worn without complaint. He was on his feet. He was not trying to hold anything in his expression. She gave him the same face back. Dr. Forsyth gave the keynote address after the sound on the field had reduced to the level where a microphone could be heard. She had revised the speech in the 20 minutes between walking to the podium to speak and being handed the microphone back to give the prepared address, revising it in the way that a person revises something when what they have just witnessed makes the prepared version insufficient. She removed the remarks about institutional leadership and replaced them with something she had not prepared but that arrived from what she had seen. She spoke for 18 minutes without notes. She said, "I have attended more than 200 school commencement ceremonies in my career as an educator and as a state official. I have never seen what I saw on this field 40 minutes ago. I have never seen 500 people choose silence as a form of statement without being organized, without being asked, and hold it for the length of time you held it. I want you to understand what that means, not as a gesture, but as a fact. You demonstrated in public that you have been taught to understand what a moment requires and to respond to it with your whole community. That is the highest educational outcome I know how to name." She paused. She said, "The education you received here was not just academic. You were taught to be a community that responds to each other. You will take that with you to wherever you go next, and the communities you join will be different for having you in them. That is what your principal built here. And today, you showed her and everyone watching that she built it correctly." She stepped away from the podium. The field received it the same way it had received everything that afternoon, completely without reservation. The diplomas were given. Dr. Okafor presented each one herself as she always had because the presentation was not a ceremony. It was an acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement deserved to be personal. She stood at the right side of the stage in her regalia, and she called each name and she put each diploma in each hand, and she looked each student in the eye for the 2 seconds of the handshake, and what she communicated in those 2 seconds was specific to each student and was understood by each student in the specific way that you understand something spoken directly to you by someone who knows you. Destiny Okonkwo crossed the stage first because she was first alphabetically and had been in seat A1 and was the student who had stood first in the silence. She crossed the stage with a walk that was composed and forward-facing, the walk of someone who has decided to carry the moment rather than be carried by it. Dr. Okafor said her name. She put the diploma in her hand. She said quietly enough that only Destiny could hear, "I saw you stand first." Destiny looked at her. She did not say anything. She went. Tamara Jefferson crossed the stage 37 names later. 4 years earlier, Tamara had sat in Dr. Okafor's office and said, "I don't understand why people here act like they're actually going to go somewhere." She crossed the stage now, with the University of Georgia acceptance on record, and 60% of her first year covered by merit scholarship, and her mother was in the 3rd row of the family section on the east side, and her mother was on her feet before Tamara had taken 3 steps onto the stage, and the sound her mother made was not a sound that can be described in language. It was the specific sound of a woman whose daughter is crossing a stage, and it contained 4 years in it. Dr. Okafor said Tamara's name. She put the diploma in her hand. Tamara said in the brief moment of the handshake, "I believed you." Dr. Okafor said, "I know." Tamara went. Marcus Osei crossed the stage 41 names after Tamara. He had been on a medical alert plan for most of his junior year. He had met every requirement of his recovery plan. He was graduating on time. When he crossed the stage, he had the expression of someone who does not quite believe that what is happening, and the expression was on his face for only a moment before it resolved into something steadier, and Dr. Okafor saw both the disbelief and the resolution, and she said his name clearly and gave him the diploma with the specific weight that a diploma carries when it represents something that was not guaranteed. He crossed the stage. He looked back once from the stairs on the far side before he descended. She did not see him look back. She was already saying the next name. Jalen Osei crossed the stage at 2:47. She said his name. She put the diploma in his hand. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was not the expression from the stage entrance, the slightly stunned threshold expression, but something different. Something that had arrived in him on the other side of the afternoon, in the hours between that conversation near the stage entrance and this moment at the podium. She could not name it. But she recognized it as the expression of someone who has come through something and understands now what they came through it for. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. The look said what it needed to say. He went. Simone Morris crossed the stage 14 names after Jalen. She was the student photographer, the one who had been standing somewhere in the family section in her graduation robe with a phone, who had photographed the silence. But at 1:58, when Callaghan had crossed the field toward the stage steps, Simone had not been in the family section. She had been in her alphabetical position in the second row of the graduates, and she had watched the officer approach with the particular trained attention of someone who has spent 4 years learning to see what is happening in a room before the room has finished producing it. She had seen the handcuffs. She had seen her principal stand still. She had not photographed any of it. Her phone was in the pocket of her graduation robe, and she had left it there because she had understood in that specific moment that what she was looking at required her to be part of it, rather than a witness to it from behind a lens. And being part of it meant standing in her row, in her cap and gown, in the silence that was moving through the seated section from the front. She had stood. She had held the silence for the full 2 minutes and 17 seconds of its duration, looking at Dr. Okafor at the stage steps with the fixed attention of someone who has decided that the thing they are looking at deserves to be witnessed completely and without mediation. After the ceremony, after Foley had removed the handcuffs and Dr. Okafor had spoken, and the field had released its held breath, Simone had stepped out of the graduate section to find her mother in the family rows. Her mother had handed her the phone. Simone had taken it, walked to the edge of the field, and photographed the field from behind the rows of white chairs with the students still in them, the stage with the banner, the afternoon light at its golden hour angle, the atmosphere of something that had just occurred and was not yet finished occurring. The photograph was very good. She knew it when she took it. Simone crossed the stage. Dr. Okafor said her name. She put the diploma in her hand. Simone looked at her and said, "I got the photograph." Dr. Okafor said, "I know. It's the right one." She said it the way she said things she meant directly without supplement. Simone went. 187 students. Every name said clearly. Every diploma personal. Every 2 seconds of handshake specific. The ceremony that had been interrupted at 1:58 and had resumed at 2:17 completed at 3:41, running slightly longer than the scheduled close because Dr. Okafor did not rush the diploma presentation and had never rushed it in 14 years because this was not the part of the ceremony that got compressed. The investigation of the complaint filed by Kevin Price was conducted by the Harmon County District Attorney's Office, which opened a formal review within 72 hours of the commencement events. The impetus for the formal review was threefold. First Sergeant Foley had filed an internal after-action report the evening of the commencement that documented with specificity the chain of command violation, the deviation from briefing protocol, and the specific harm produced by both. The report was detailed, accurate, and arrived on the duty lieutenant's desk before close of business that evening. Second, the footage from 6 separate cameras, including family members' phones, the school's ceremony videographer, and the journalist from the Harmon County Gazette was on the internet by 9 p.m. and had been viewed by the mayor's office, the school board chair, and 3 state legislators before midnight. Third, Dr. Lillian Forsythe, the state commissioner of education, had called the Harmon County DA's office at 7:43 that evening from her car on the way back to the state capitol and had said, "I was present. I watched it. I spoke at the podium. I am formally requesting a review of the complaint that produced this outcome, and I am telling you that the outcome I witnessed was not compatible with any legitimate complaint process." The DA's office had opened the review that night. The review was completed in its essential findings within 8 days. The venue coordination meeting referenced in the complaint had not occurred. There was no such meeting scheduled for the 21st. There was no venue coordinator involved in a dispute of any kind. The complaint was a fabrication-specific, detailed, and containing enough internal plausibility to pass casual inspection, but without a factual basis for any of its essential claims. The investigation established the timeline of the complaint's creation through a combination of email metadata, phone records, and the text messages on Kevin Price's department device. The complaint had been drafted on the evening of the 20th. It had been refined the morning of the 21st, the day of the commencement, with revisions that had arrived from a number not registered to Price's contacts but identified by the phone records as registered to a burner phone purchased 3 weeks earlier in Harmon County. The complaint had been filed at 9:03 a.m., 3 hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. The investigation also established the purpose of the filing. Email correspondence between Kevin Price and Councilman Ayers' private email account obtained through a court-issued warrant showed that the filing had been discussed in terms of creating a documented record of concern about Dr. Okafor's professional conduct ahead of the redistricting vote and ensuring that the ceremony itself could not be used as a platform for her public profile to be elevated further. One message from Ayers' account said, "If it disrupts the ceremony, so much the better, but the record is the main thing, The record was the main thing. Kevin Price, 26, resigned his position as aide to Councilman Ayers on the 4th day of the review before he had been formally interviewed by investigators. He hired an attorney. Councilman Ayers did not resign. He issued a statement in which he characterized the complaint as an administrative matter that had been handled inappropriately at the departmental level and expressed regret for any disruption to the ceremony. The statement did not use the word false. It did not use the word fabricated. It used the word mishandled, which is a word that describes a process rather than an intent. The Harmon County District Attorney's Office used different words. The formal investigation summary used the words false complaint filed with knowing intent to disrupt, and the words under color of political opposition, and the words abuse of the complaint process with discriminatory effect. The investigation was referred to the Harmon County Ethics Board. Brett Callaghan was suspended for 30 days pending a departmental review of his unilateral deviation from chain of command protocol and his failure to verify the complaint's factual basis before taking action. The departmental review found that the suspension was appropriate and recommended additional training in complaint assessment and event security protocols. The review did not use the word racist. It used the words procedurally deficient and judgment failure and absence of appropriate verification. These were accurate descriptions of what had occurred at the procedural level. They were not the complete description of what had occurred. The complete description required other words which were not in the departmental review, because the departmental review was a procedural document, and procedural documents are written in procedural language. The complete description was in the testimony that Sergeant Foley gave to the DA's office, in which she said, "In my assessment, Officer Callaghan's decision to approach the stage was informed not only by the complaint, but by his assumption about who the person named in the complaint was, and what kind of complaint a person of that description was likely to be the subject of. The complaint named a black woman in a position of institutional authority. Officer Callaghan's approach to that complaint was materially different from his approach to similar complaints in which the named individual was not a black woman in a position of institutional authority. I observed the difference in his approach at 2 previous events this year. Foley's testimony was in the DA's record. It was not in the departmental review. What the review found was a young officer who had received a complaint from a politically connected source and had treated the political connection as verification of the complaint's validity. He had not checked the facts. He had not consulted his supervisor. He had not read the complaint closely enough to notice that the underlying event it referenced had not occurred. He had acted on the assumption that the complaint was legitimate because it arrived from a source he associated with legitimacy, and he had acted on the assumption that the woman named in the complaint was the kind of person who produced this kind of complaint rather than the kind of person who was the target of it. He had done all of this in front of 312 people and 187 students, and the State Commissioner of Education, and a superintendent and a school board chair at a graduation ceremony that had been in preparation for 4 years. Sergeant Foley was not suspended. She was formally commended for her rapid response and for the after-action report she had filed, which the DA's investigation had characterized as one of the most thorough and accurate event security reports they had reviewed. She continued as the senior officer on special assignments detail. The department revised its protocol for forwarded complaints going forward. Any complaint received by more than one officer required the senior officer to be the sole point of contact for any on-site action. No unilateral deviation from chain of command was authorized under any circumstances. The revision was named after the date of the commencement ceremony. It was not named after Callaghan, who had caused it to be necessary. It was not named after Okafor, whose situation had revealed the gap. It was named after the date, which was what the policy document required. But in the department among the officers who worked events, the revision was referred to by a different name. They called it the graduation protocol. They knew which graduation. The silence of the students had been recorded by 6 separate cameras, the phones of family members, the school's own ceremony videographer, a journalist from the Harmon County Gazette who had been present to cover the commencement and who had shifted after 2 minutes from covering the commencement to recording something that was not a commencement story. The footage was on the internet by 9 o'clock that evening. It showed the students standing. It showed the silence. It showed Lillian Forsythe walking to the podium. It showed Dr. Okafor at the podium looking at her students saying, "You stood up." It showed the field when the silence broke, which was a thing that could be seen even without the sound, the simultaneous movement of 500 bodies from standing stillness to standing motion. The difference between the two being the difference between holding and releasing. The footage was viewed over 4 million times in the first 72 hours. In the 24 hours after the footage went online, Harmon County Preparatory Academy received 412 emails from across the state and from other states. Parents wrote. Educators wrote. Former students of schools that were not Harmon County Preparatory wrote. People who had been at commencement ceremonies that had not produced this wrote. People who had spent careers in education and who recognized in the footage something they had been trying to build and had not yet managed to build wrote. Some of them described what they saw in the footage. Some of them described what they had built in their own schools. Some of them described what they wished they had built. Dr. Cassandra Wells read every email. She organized them into folders. She printed 40 of them, the ones that she thought would mean the most to the students in whose honor they had been written, and she put them in the display case in the main hallway next to the photograph Simone Morris had taken. Dr. Evelyn Grace Okafor did not read the emails. She did not read them because she had students to teach in the morning, and the emails were not about the morning. They were about the afternoon that had already occurred and that the record had already captured. She had read the record. She had been part of making it. The emails were the world's response to the record, which was its own thing and which did not require her participation to be what it was. She did not watch the footage. She did not watch it because she had been there and she had seen it in real time. and what she had seen in real time was more than what any screen would show her. She had seen the students standing. She had felt the silence on the field as a physical pressure, the specific enacted pressure of 500 people choosing silence as a form of statement at cost to themselves without being asked. She had looked at them from the stage steps with the handcuffs on her wrists, and she had thought, this is what 4 years builds. This is what correct teaching produces. Not the quiet compliance of a student body that has been told to be good, the active, chosen, deliberate dignity of a community that understands what a moment requires and gives it. She had thought if this is what the ceremony cost, the ceremony was worth it. She had not meant the disruption. She had meant what came after. The redistricting vote was held in the fall, 6 months after the commencement. It passed by 4 votes. The boundaries were adjusted. The first cohort of students from the newly redistricted census tracts arrived at Harmon County Preparatory Academy the following September. They did not know what they were walking into. They would find out. Evelyn Okafor would walk the halls on the first morning of that school year, noting what was correct and what needed adjustment, saying, names making contact. She would find the ones who needed a moment and give them the moment they needed. She would look at the display case in the main hallway with Simone Morris's photograph and the 40 printed emails from people who had seen the footage, and she would think, this is what we have built, and this is what we are building, and the distance between those two things is this school year, and the school year begins today. She had built it correctly. She was not finished building it. 3 weeks after the commencement, Evelyn Okafor testified before the Harmon County Ethics Board in the matter of Councilman Ayres's conduct. She had prepared for the testimony the same way she prepared for every official proceeding, with the specific documented precision that 23 years of navigating institutional processes had produced. She had organized the evidence, chronologically annotated each document with its source and the date of its creation, and created an index that allowed the board to locate any specific piece of evidence within the record in under 30 seconds. She had not hired a communications consultant to prepare her remarks, though she had been offered one by the district. She had said, I know what happened. I know how to describe what happened. I will describe it. She arrived at the ethics board hearing room 20 minutes early. She set up her materials at the witness table in the order she intended to use them. She sat down. She waited. The board was composed of 7 members. She knew 4 of them by professional association. She had worked with 2 of them on committee matters in the past 3 years. She addressed all 7 with the same quality of attention because the record required it to be that way. She was given 30 minutes for her opening statement. She used 24. She said the complaint filed by Kevin Price on the morning of the commencement ceremony was a fabrication. The venue coordination meeting it references did not occur. The dispute it describes did not occur. The complaint was created to produce a specific outcome, the disruption of the commencement ceremony of 187 students and the association of my name with a formal complaint in the period before a school board redistricting vote. I will now present the evidence for each of those conclusions in order. She presented every document in order with annotation. She identified each exhibit by its provenance and its relevance. She read the relevant passages from the email correspondence, including the passage in which Councilman Ayres's account had described the commencement disruption as so much the better. She did not editorialize about that passage. She read it and let the board read it themselves and let the reading do what the reading did. She answered every question from the board members directly without elaboration, beyond what was asked, and without reduction below what was relevant. At the end of her testimony, the board chair, Dr. Patricia Whitmore, said, Dr. Okafor, I have one final question. She said yes. The chair said you said in your opening statement that the purpose of the complaint was to disrupt the ceremony. In your assessment, did it accomplish that purpose? Dr. Okafor was quiet for a moment. She said it disrupted the ceremony for 19 minutes. During those 19 minutes, 187 students stood in complete silence in their caps and gowns and produced the most powerful expression of solidarity and institutional understanding I have witnessed in 23 years in education. So, in the sense of disruption, yes. In the sense of accomplishing the stated purpose of diminishing the ceremony, no. The ceremony was not diminished. It was the opposite of diminished. The board chair wrote something on her notepad. She said the record will reflect that statement. The ethics board deliberated for 3 hours and 12 minutes. They found that the complaint had been filed with the intent to interfere with a public educational event, that the interference had been achieved through the submission of knowingly false information, and that the conduct constituted an abuse of the complaint process for personal political purposes in the conduct of elected official duties. Councilman Ayers was formally censured. The censure was entered into the public record and would remain in the public record. He was required to issue a formal retraction of the complaint and a public statement acknowledging the harm to the ceremony, the school, the students, and the principal. He issued a statement that used the words, "I acknowledge this complaint should not have been filed," and the words, "I regret the disruption to the students." It did not use the word false. It did not use the word fabricated. It did not use the words, "I created this complaint for political purposes." It used the words acknowledge and regret, which are words that describe a state of mind rather than an action, and which do not require a person to take responsibility for the action that produced the state of mind. The statement was read into the public record. Evelyn Okafor read it once. She set it beside the censure document in the file she was maintaining. She did not comment on it. She went back to the school. There was a new academic year beginning. Students were arriving who had never walked through the doors of Harmon County Preparatory Academy. Students who did not yet know what the school was, or what it could do for them, or what it required of them in return, and whose initial experience of it was the first week of the new academic year, which Dr. Okafor had designed over 23 years of iteration to communicate in the first 5 days the essential character of the institution, what it believed about the people walking through its doors, and what it expected them to believe about themselves. She was 62 years old. She had been doing this for 23 years. She was not finished. She walked through the school on the first morning of the new academic year, the way she walked it every first morning of every new academic year, and she noted what was correct and what needed adjustment, and who was in which hallway and which corners of the building had the energy that good beginnings have, and which did not yet. The halls were the same halls. The students were different students. The building was still the one that had been designated a low-priority resource allocation campus when she arrived 14 years ago, and was now one of 3 national blue ribbon schools in the state, and the building itself had not changed as much as the thing that happened inside it had changed, and the thing that happened inside it would continue to change under her direction for as long as she was there to direct it. She stopped in the main hallway near the entrance and looked at the student artwork on the walls. The artwork had been there in various forms since her first year when she had asked the art teachers to develop a rotating exhibition program for student work, because she wanted every student who walked through the main entrance to see evidence of what other students at this school were capable of, which was a form of teaching that did not require a classroom. The current exhibition was the work of the junior class paintings and photographs and mixed media that the art department had selected in a jury process that the students had run themselves, because running the jury process was part of the education. One piece was a photograph taken at the commencement. It had been taken by a student named Simone Morris, who was now a senior, who had been standing in the family section that afternoon with her phone and who had photographed the moment of the silence. The photograph showed a wide shot of the field, the rows of white chairs, the students standing in them, the stage with the banner, the afternoon light at its golden hour angle. It showed the silence as a visual fact, the uniformity of the standing figures, the direction of their attention, the stillness of the whole. It was a very good photograph. Dr. Okafor looked at it for a moment. She thought about what it showed. She thought about what it did not show: the weight of the silence, the cost of holding it, the specific courage of standing up. When standing up is the only response available, and the response is to something you cannot control. Those things were not in the photograph. They were in the students. She thought about what the redistricting vote would mean if it passed the students from the underserved census tracts who would be directed to this school, who would arrive not knowing what it was, the way the students who had arrived 14 years ago had not known what it was. She thought about what it would take to build for them the same thing she had built for the students who had graduated in May. She thought exactly what it took the first time. You read the students. You build for what you find. You do not allow the institution's self-assessment to be the final word on what the students are capable of. She had been doing this for 23 years. She was not finished. She walked on through the hallway. She noted the artwork on the east wall where 2 new pieces had been installed by the art department over the summer. She noted the light through the eastern windows, which had always been strong in the morning in this hallway, and which required the window coverings to be set at their middle position before the first classes, or the light made the wall art impossible to see. She noted a water fountain that was making a sound it should not make. She made a mental note to report it to the plant manager. She had built it correctly. She had built it the right way, even when the right way required fighting for it, even when the right way produced opposition from people with political standing and access to the complaint process, even when the right way cost something on a Tuesday afternoon in May in front of everyone who mattered most to her. She had built it the right way because the students who needed it had no alternative to it being right, and she was the person whose job it was to make it right. And that job did not have an expiration date that she recognized, and the students, when the moment had come, had understood that. They had stood up, they had been silent, and the silence had said everything that needed to be said. What you build with care and with the correct standard over years in service of people who are counting on you to do it right, that does not disappear when someone tries to interrupt it. It persists. It is witnessed. It stands in 300 white chairs in complete silence on a Tuesday afternoon in May, and it says without a single word that it will still be here when the interruption is over. And the record of that afternoon exists. It exists in 4 million views, and in the testimony of the Ethics Board, and in the certificate of censure in the public record, and in the memory of 187 students who crossed a stage with their diplomas in their hands on a day they will carry for the rest of their lives. It exists in the look Marcus gave his mother from the 4th row of the faculty section. It exists in Simone Morris's photograph hanging in the display case in the main hallway of Harmon County Preparatory Academy, showing the field in the silence, the rows of white chairs, the students standing the golden hour light at its afternoon angle, the stage with the banner. It exists in the graduation protocol named after the date, which is how the Harmon County Police Department refers to the revised chain of command procedure for forwarded complaints that Sergeant Foley's after-action report made necessary. It exists in the redistricting vote that passed in the fall by 4 votes, and in the students who walked through the doors of Harmon County Preparatory the following September, not knowing what they were walking into and who would spend the next 4 years finding out. It exists in what Evelyn Okafor said at the podium after the handcuffs were removed, which was heard by everyone on the field that afternoon and which was seen by 4 million people who were not there. You stood up. You were silent. You understood what the moment required, and you gave it. It exists in the silence that produced that speech. It exists in the student who stood first in seat A1 whose name was Destiny, which is the kind of name that acquires additional weight in retrospect. And it exists in the fact that a 62-year-old woman in her doctoral regalia with handcuffs on her wrists at the commencement she had built and run 14 times, looked at the students she had built the school for and looked only at them, and the thing she communicated without a word, the thing visible in 4 million viewings at 1 frame per second in the clear and direct light of a May afternoon in Georgia, was not fear, and was not despair, and was not even anger. It was the complete and undisrupted presence of someone who knows what they have built, and knows it will still be standing when the interruption is over. She was right. It is still standing. Subscribe our channel for more stories about people who built something worth protecting, and what happened when the record showed exactly who protected it.